They looked untouchable from the outside. Two smiling faces framed by western sunsets, faith stitched into every public word. Love so steady it felt permanent. For decades, America didn't just watch Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. It trusted them. They were comfort, certainty, proof that some stories really did get happy endings. But what happens when the cameras turn off and the losses don't stop? Because behind the wholesome image and the happy trails goodbye was a life marked by repeated heartbreak, the kind that doesn't fade with applause. One tragedy didn't break them, neither did two or three. Loss came for their children, for their peace, and eventually for each other. Quietly, relentlessly. This isn't the fairy tale version you grew up with. It's the story of what they endured when faith was tested, when fame offered no protection, and when love had to survive things it was never meant to face. And the final chapter? That's the part Hollywood rarely talks about, because it's not just sad, it's haunting. They didn't start as legends, they started as survivors. Long before the name Roy Rogers carried weight, before it echoed through theaters and living rooms across America, there was a boy learning very early that comfort was never guaranteed. Leonard Franklin Sly grew up in circumstances that demanded toughness long before they offered opportunity. His childhood wasn't shaped by dreams of fame, but by necessity, adaptation, and an understanding that nothing in life arrived easily. The family moved constantly, chasing stability that never quite stuck. When city life failed them, they tried the river. When the river failed them, they rebuilt from scraps. When floods destroyed what little they had, they salvaged what remained and kept going. That pattern, lose, rebuild, endure, quietly became the blueprint for Roy's entire life. As a child, Leonard learned to work before he learned to hope. On the isolated farm where his family eventually settled, survival depended on everyone pulling their weight. His mother, living with a physical disability, still managed the household with relentless determination. His father worked punishing factory shifts during the week, then returned home to labor on the farm during what little rest he had. Watching them shaped Leonard's sense of responsibility in ways no classroom ever could. But hardship didn't strip the house of joy. If anything, it forced creativity. With no radio and no entertainment to lean on, the family became its own stage. Music wasn't a hobby, it was connection. Saturday nights filled with neighbors, dancing, laughter, and shared exhaustion. Leonard didn't just participate, he led, he sang, he played. He learned how to hold attention without knowing that skill would one day feed millions. Even his voice was shaped by necessity. On a farm stretched wide and unforgiving, shouting was communication. Leonard learned to project, to carry sound across distance. What began as survival turned into instinct, and instinct slowly turned into talent. Then the Depression arrived, and survival stopped being theoretical. Leonard left school to work alongside his father, putting in long hours at a shoe factory. He tried to balance exhaustion with night classes, clinging to the idea that education might still matter. But one moment of public humiliation ended that chapter for good. Falling asleep in class after an endless shift earned him laughter, not understanding. He walked away, not because he lacked ambition, but because dignity mattered more than approval. That decision closed one door and quietly unlocked another. California wasn't a destination yet. It was a rumor, a feeling, a pull Leonard couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. The first trip west didn't bring success, but it planted certainty. His future wasn't where he was standing. When he returned, he didn't come back unchanged. He came back restless. The second time, he stayed. California didn't greet him with opportunity. It met him with labor camps, road crews, and peach fields. He slept where work allowed. He earned barely enough to survive. But something inside him refused to harden. Even in the worst conditions, Leonard believed his life wasn't meant to stay small. That belief, quiet, stubborn, almost irrational, kept him open when others shut down. And then came a moment that should have terrified him, a radio audition. He wasn't confident, he wasn't polished, He wasn't even sure he belonged there, but someone else believed before he did. With borrowed courage and a hand-sewn Western shirt, Leonard stepped into a studio and did the only thing he knew how to do: be himself. He sang, he played, he yodeled, and instead of falling apart, everything clicked. That broadcast changed his life faster than he could process. Paid work followed almost immediately. Music stopped being something he loved and became something that could carry him forward. Still, Leonard never chased the spotlight alone. He believed in collaboration, in harmony, in shared success. That instinct led him to partnerships that would reshape his future, even if he didn't realize it yet. But stability remained elusive. Leonard drifted from group to group, never quite finding the perfect fit. The radio kept him afloat, but certainty stayed just out of reach. He lived like a musical nomad, trusting that persistence would eventually be rewarded. And while his professional life struggled to settle, his personal life took a surprising turn. Love arrived through a radio signal. A simple on-air exchange turned into letters, then visits, then something unmistakably real. Grace Arlene Wilkins wasn't part of the entertainment world, and maybe that's why their connection felt grounding. She believed in him without asking him to be anything more than he already was. When they married, it wasn't flashy, it was sincere. For a time, life balanced itself. They built a family, they adopted, they welcomed children. Leonard, now steadily becoming Roy, finally had something that felt like permanence. But happiness in his life had a pattern. It never stayed untouched for long. The birth of his son should have been a moment of pure joy. Instead, it became devastation. Losing Grace to childbirth complications shattered Roy in ways no audience ever saw. Overnight, he became a single father to 3 young children, carrying grief so heavy it barely left room to breathe. And yet, the world still expected him to smile, to perform, to show up. He did. Because that's what he'd always done. Professionally, everything accelerated at once. Music exploded into national recognition. Film studios noticed. Opportunities stacked on top of each other faster than grief could be processed. A new name, a new image, a new identity emerged, not as an escape from pain, but as armor against it. Roy Rogers wasn't born from ambition alone. He was forged by necessity, loss, and the refusal to stop moving forward. When audiences saw him on screen, confident, calm, morally unshakable, they weren't watching a fantasy. They were watching someone who had already survived more than most people ever would. Someone who believed deeply in goodness because he had seen how fragile life could be without it. And just as his career reached a height no one could have predicted, fate quietly prepared another turning point. Because the woman who would change everything again, who would become both his greatest partner and his greatest test, was already stepping into his life. And neither of them knew just how much heartbreak still lay ahead. By the time Roy Rogers truly arrived in Hollywood, he didn't look like a gamble. He looked inevitable. Studios had seen singing cowboys before, but there was something different about Roy. He wasn't pretending to be steady. He was steady. The calm confidence audiences felt wasn't manufactured. It was lived. Every loss he'd endured, every instability he'd survived, showed up as quiet authority on screen. When he sang, it didn't feel rehearsed, it felt honest. The transformation from Leonard Sly to Roy Rogers wasn't cosmetic. It was strategic, yes, but it was also protective. The name carried strength, permanence, a sense of moral certainty that audiences craved during uncertain times. And the timing couldn't have been better. As Westerns surged in popularity, Roy didn't just ride the wave, he reshaped it. Then there was Trigger. The bond between Roy and his horse wasn't branding, it was genuine trust. Trigger wasn't a prop or a gimmick, he was a partner. Roy insisted on riding only him, training with him, trusting him in ways few actors ever trusted an animal on set. Audiences felt that connection instantly. It grounded the spectacle. It made the fantasy believable. By the early 1940s, Roy Rogers wasn't simply successful, he was dominant. While other stars chased short-term contracts, Roy thought long-term. He negotiated control over his name, his image, his likeness, decisions that quietly made him one of the most powerful figures in entertainment. Merchandising followed, then exploded. Toys, books, comics, clothing. Roy Rogers became a presence in American homes far beyond the movie screen, and still, he carried grief. Fame didn't soften the loss of his first wife. It didn't ease the responsibility of raising 3 children alone. If anything, success made the weight heavier. He had more to protect now, more to lose. That's when Dale Evans stepped fully into his life. At first, she was simply a co-star, sharp, capable, warm in a way that balanced Roy's grounded seriousness. On screen, they worked effortlessly together. Off-screen, something slower and deeper took shape. Dale didn't rush him. She understood grief without needing to name it. She brought laughter without asking him to forget. Love didn't arrive as a dramatic spark. It arrived as safety. When Roy proposed to Dale in front of thousands, it wasn't spectacle. It was conviction. After years shaped by loss and restraint, he chose visibility not for attention, but for commitment. Their marriage wasn't a fairy tale sold to the public. It was a foundation deliberately built. Audiences felt the difference instantly. Together, Roy and Dale came to represent steadiness in an uncertain era, principled, sincere, and grounded. Their appeal wasn't rooted in flash or cynicism, but in reassurance. Even as Roy took real risks and rejected shortcuts, including walking away from a powerful studio to embrace television, every decision reflected the same belief. Integrity mattered more than comfort, and trust mattered more than control. Faith was never hidden. Roy and Dale didn't preach, but they didn't dilute their beliefs either. Values were woven into the stories naturally: responsibility, compassion, integrity. It wasn't performative, it was consistent. And that consistency built trust that outlasted trends. But even as their professional life stabilized, their personal life was about to fracture in ways no success could cushion. When their daughter Robin was born, joy turned quickly into fear. The diagnosis shattered expectations and exposed the harsh reality of the era. Doctors spoke clinically, coldly. They advised distance, detachment, institutionalization. Roy and Dale refused. They didn't see a condition. They saw a child. Their child. They adopted more children, opened their home wider, turned pain into purpose. Each adoption wasn't charity. It was conviction. They believed family was chosen as much as it was given. But tragedy returned. When Debbie died in a bus accident, the loss reopened wounds that had never fully healed. For Roy, it was confirmation of a painful truth. Love did not guarantee safety. Faith did not guarantee protection. All it guaranteed was meaning. The ranches, the moves, the fresh starts, none of them erased grief. They simply gave it space to breathe. As their careers slowed and the spotlight softened, Roy and Dale became more reflective, less interested in expansion, more focused on legacy. Roy turned down political opportunities, unwilling to fracture the unity he'd built with fans across beliefs and backgrounds. Fame had never been his goal. Connection was. When Roy died, the loss hit differently. This wasn't sudden tragedy. It was finality. For Dale, it wasn't just the loss of a husband, it was the loss of her witness, the one person who had lived every chapter with her. Grief returned, heavier and quieter. This time, it didn't demand strength. It demanded endurance. She followed him not long after. Same condition, same ending. As if even their bodies refused to be separated. They were buried side by side, not as legends, not as symbols, but as two people who chose love repeatedly in a life that tested it relentlessly. And that's why their story lasts. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. By the time the spotlight finally began to fade, Roy and Dale had already lived several lifetimes' worth of joy and loss. To the public, they were still symbols, smiling, steady, reassuring. But behind closed doors, their lives had been shaped by grief that never truly loosened its grip. What made their story remarkable wasn't that tragedy touched them. It was that tragedy kept coming, and they kept choosing love anyway. Faith became less about certainty and more about survival. Roy had always believed deeply. But later in life, belief wasn't something he spoke about loudly. It was something he carried quietly. It guided his decisions, his boundaries, and his refusal to compromise even when compromise would have been easier. That's why moments like the Wonder Woman incident mattered. To outsiders, it may have looked stubborn. To Roy, it was consistency. He had built a life around values, and he wasn't going to abandon them just to stay relevant. Relevance had never been the point. That same mindset explained why he declined political power when it was offered. Fame had given him reach, not authority, and he knew the difference. He didn't want to divide the people who had trusted him for decades. That restraint spoke louder than ambition ever could. As years passed, the roles slowed. The applause softened. The empire became legacy rather than momentum. Roy didn't chase reinvention. He didn't resent the changing industry. He accepted time the way he had accepted everything else in his life, with calm realism. Dale, meanwhile, carried grief differently. She learned early that pain doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It only grows heavier. For Dale, the only way forward was through expression. She didn't bury her grief. She translated it. Writing Angel Unaware was never about reopening wounds or asking for sympathy. It was an act of meaning, a way of saying that a short life is not a small one, and that love doesn't lose its value just because it ends too soon. At a time when parents were quietly encouraged to forget children who didn't fit society's definition of normal, Dale refused to accept that logic. Her words became a voice for families who had been told their grief should be minimized, their love restrained, their loss quietly erased. That belief reshaped everything that followed. Their home didn't become a place of silence after loss. It became fuller, louder, more alive. Children came and went. Stories overlapped. Joy and grief existed in the same rooms without apology. Laughter didn't cancel sorrow. It lived alongside it. And even as heartbreak returned again and again, Roy and Dale never retreated inward. They kept the doors open, to family, to faith, and to a world that still needed proof that love could endure even after unimaginable loss. What they learned and lived was that pain doesn't shrink love, it clarifies it. When Roy's health declined, it wasn't dramatic, it was gradual. The kind of ending that gives you time to think but never enough time to prepare. Congestive heart failure doesn't arrive with spectacle. It arrives with quiet limits, less energy, shorter walks, slower mornings. Roy faced it the same way he faced everything else, without complaint. When he passed away at 86, the world lost an icon. Dale lost the one person who had stood beside her through every version of herself. The grief this time was different. It wasn't chaotic. It was absolute. Final. The kind of loss that doesn't disrupt life. It empties it. She survived him, but she never replaced him. In interviews, friends noticed the change immediately. The strength was still there, but the center was gone. Roy had been her witness, her shared memory, her proof that what they lived wasn't imagined. For 2.5 years, she carried on, supported by her children, grounded in faith, sustained by legacy. But the heart has its own limits, and in a strange symmetry that felt almost intentional, Dale passed away from the same condition that took Roy. Congestive heart failure, different bodies, same ending. They were laid to rest side by side, exactly as they had lived, together. Not frozen in their most famous moments, not preserved as characters, but remembered as two people who endured far more than the images suggested. And that's why their story still resonates. Because beneath the Western songs, the smiling posters, and the carefully framed photographs, there was something real. A marriage that didn't survive because it was easy, but because it was chosen again and again, even when the cost was unbearable. Roy Rogers and Dale Evans didn't live a fairy tale. They lived a test, and they passed it, not by avoiding heartbreak, but by refusing to let it erase love. If this story changed the way you see Roy and Dale, not as icons but as people, take a moment to like this video. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered beyond the highlight reel, share it with someone who values real legacy. And if you want more untold histories like this one, subscribe to the channel. Now tell me this in the comments. Do you think enduring love is about faith, resilience, or simply choosing each other no matter the cost?